is the future, technology, theocracy, and the 1,000-year Reich, which might sound like a crock of expletive deleted to some people. I do think, though, that in a strange sort of way, technology, religion, and totalitarianism are going to be fused in the world that's coming. Whenever you're talking about the future, whenever one is talking about the future, obviously to a certain extent, one is casting about. The future hasn't happened yet, so I want to underscore that what I'm doing this evening is engaging in informed conjecture. For that reason, rather than attempt to play Gene Dixon and give you specific predictions, Princess Di will marry Newt Gingrich later on this year or something of that kind, I'm going to attempt to outline the basic features of the way in which I think the world is going to develop and why I think the world is going to develop in that fashion. I will make we'll make a few relatively specific predictions, but I want to stress that getting too specific in one's predictions, I think, is asking for trouble. For one thing, it's pretentious as hell, and I try to avoid pretense when I can. I can be pretty hard-nosed about my analysis of what is going on and what has gone on in the past, because the past and the present, at least to a certain extent, are knowable. The future, obviously, has not happened yet, and so to a certain extent, becoming too detailed, I think, is a form of dishonesty, and that's not something that I want to start the new year off by engaging in. I also am going to strive mightily, and this is going to be maybe the most difficult aspect of the talk this evening, I'm going to strive mightily to conclude things in time so that we have a sizable amount of time for questions from the audience. And what might be missing in terms of specifics in the lecture will hopefully be filled in by commentary and or constructive criticism, hopefully constructive criticism, or questions on your part. In part, at least, in hopes of finishing in time to have questions, one of the reasons why I'm not going to get into too much detail about what is going to be happening. I also want to emphasize that past a point, the things that I see as developing, well, I certainly think they're going to happen, but I would not want to be pinned down as to saying exactly when I think this is going to happen, or precisely when the world that I see coming is going to be in effect. As conjectural as the discussion is going to be this evening, I also want to emphasize that I believe very strongly that as a general consideration, the direction that I see things taking and the direction that I'm going to be outlining for you this evening is definitely where I think things are going. And I think there are already enough firm indications of the direction things are taking that we can, in a sense, extrapolate from the direction things are going in now to where things are going to be going at some point in the future. In future broadcasts on Roy's program, you will be hearing some programs in which a program in which I read the information that I'm going to be kicking off the lecture this evening by reading, by way of perhaps presenting a contemporary analytical framework in order to serve as a launching pad or a point of departure for the line of analysis that I'm going to be presenting this evening. I'd like to read a section of one and all of another op-ed column that appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle on successive days in the second week in January of this year. In past broadcasts, I've stated that something that leaves me feeling very ambivalent is the extent to which I'm now reading on the editorial pages and in the op-ed columns of major daily newspapers. I'm reading comments by editorial writers, by guest columnists that sound like they could have been taken straight off of One Step Beyond, either One Step Beyond of 10 years ago or One Step Beyond of 10 weeks ago. On the one hand, that is a positive experience because it is reinforcing of one's own political instincts and affirming of one's own political vision and line of analysis. So that is a positive, that engenders a positive reaction. On the other hand, what is going on and what is being presented in these columns and in this commentary is so absolutely, unequivocally awful that I find myself feeling bad about feeling good. And maybe that is about as good a place for analyzing what's going to be happening in the future as one could. It's not so much that you're going to be feeling bad about feeling good, but I think there are going to be massive forces conspiring, and I mean conspiring with a capital C. There's the C word, conspiracy. There will be very powerful forces. Oh, by the way, are we rolling here? Good. There will be very powerful forces that are going to be conspiring mightily in the future to make you feel good about feeling bad. Because I think that the direction that things are going to be taking is going to be extremely unpleasant for the vast majority of people. That majority of people will be capable of reversing the situation. Do we have a copy of the flyer for tonight's lecture handy? If we could perhaps circulate a couple of these around. The artwork, for those of you who have not seen it, there's a motto here. It says, "Don't ever give up." And it shows a large bird, a heron or a crane or something like that, attempting to swallow a frog. That's what's here. And the frog is grabbing the bird around its neck and constricting its throat so it can't swallow it, even as it is in the beak of the bird. I guess you could say it was paying the bill under the circumstances. This, in a sense, is the underlying message. I'm sometimes accused, perhaps not unjustly so, of presenting things in such a way as I defeat people psychologically. I make them feel as though things are hopeless, and they then leave either a broadcast of mine and or a lecture feeling that there's absolutely nothing that they can do. It is a very common response on people's part to say, well, gee, Dave, I believe the things you're saying, but I just feel so overwhelmed that I don't think there's anything that I can do. I think that things are indeed moving in a very, very bad direction. I think that there are two elements of hope, or perhaps one element of hope and one element of determination, which hopefully will propel you in the direction of hope. One of the things that I think is a cause for optimism, and I don't think there are many, but that is the tremendous expansion in the ability of an individual to assimilate and process and communicate information. The invention of relatively primitive technological devices such as the radio and the cassette recorder and the talk show and the telephone permit things like talk radio, which, even though it has been used as a vehicle for political reaction in recent years in this country, offers a tremendous opportunity for people to communicate with their fellow citizens. When you call up KABC or KFI or one of these other stations, yeah, granted, the host might be somebody that would have been rejected as a walk-on for the Flintstones. That does not necessarily mean, though, that with a little bit of forethought and with a little bit of determination, you can't use that program to communicate with other people. I know on many of the talk shows in Northern California, the hosts are very quick with the finger on the phone button if you don't agree with them, and most of them fall to the right of Ivan the Terrible. But nonetheless, if you get a few people together and keep hammering away, it sounds very bad for a talk show host to cut off 6 people in a row. It makes him look like an executioner. That's bad, and he loses. And on the other hand, when you hear 6 or 7 people on a talk show all saying the same thing, that's a very small number of people overall, and yet it sounds like a groundswell. It sounds like a popular movement. In a more sophisticated technological way, things like the computer, advents like the internet, give people a tremendous ability to communicate with their fellow citizens. And I think, to a large extent, the assimilation and dissemination of the proper information may very well determine the future of the human race. So I think it's incumbent on every one of us never to give up. I think it's incumbent on every one of us to grasp the neck of our would-be consumer. We live in a consumer society. Well, that heron is consuming that frog, and I think in a sense that is the kind of consumer society that we're going to find ourselves living in. and I think it's incumbent on each of us to grab the throat of our would-be devourer and to use our ability to assimilate and communicate information to prevent getting swallowed, even though it might appear that we're just about to go down the throat of our tormentor. I also think it's important not to kid oneself about just how bad things are and about how bad things are going to be, because things are going to get really, really bad. If you think things are bad now, just bear in mind the old saying that there's nothing like stepping in a cow flop to make you realize how nice tripping over a stone could be, and can be. And right now we're tripping over a stone. Well, just wait till you step in a cow flop. These are going to look like the good old days, as bad as they may seem now. That, I think, can be utilized in a strategic sense to motivate oneself to shoulder the task of being a good citizen, to shoulder the task of assimilating information and communicating it in order to educate one's fellow citizens to a sufficient extent to permit viable, broad-based political action, because all of our survival, I think, spiritually, I suspect, as well as physically, is going to depend on a sufficient number of people becoming sufficiently effective in the arena of political action. So don't ever kid yourself about what the consequences will be if you don't grab that bird's throat. You will get et, no question about it. You will be swallowed, and it will not be a whole lot of fun. Again, to repeat that pun that I was making, you will pay the bill, so to speak. There were two columns that appeared in January of 1995, just a couple of weeks ago, or actually a little over a week ago, which in many ways, I think, as I said earlier, will serve as a point of departure for tonight's discussion. On Thursday, January 12th of 1995, there was an op-ed column in the San Francisco Chronicle, a very conservative newspaper, by the way, 50% owned by the Hearst organization. There was an op-ed column by Arthur Miller, the famous playwright and author of, among other plays, Death of the Salesman, that many people are familiar with. Arthur Miller began in a satirical vein, and he entitled this column, "The Best Congress Money Can Buy." What he begins by doing is suggesting that we simply remove the hypocrisy from our contemporary political system by having our congressional representatives employed directly by various corporations. In other words, a representative, rather than representing ostensibly the 12th congressional district, would simply represent General Motors or a drug company or something of that kind, and that this would actually eliminate hypocrisy, would stimulate interest in our political system, because now the veneer would be taken off and people would be able to appreciate the political process for what it really is. He also goes on to say that the same thing should happen with the Supreme Court. This way the auto industry justice could work out a quid pro quo with the agribusiness justice to throw out cases which might be harmful to the interests that are backing each of the justices. Then, however, Arthur Miller switches to a much more incisive and serious vein, and I think he delivers a body blow which should not be misunderstood by people reading the column. I think he then goes on to highlight and underscore the nature of his satirical comments by making some comments that I not only agree with, but some comments that I think we all need to understand, and also, not incidentally, comments which agree completely with an analysis that I presented about 5 years previous to the time this column was written. In February of 1990, almost 5 years ago, I did an archive show called Uncle Sam and Il Duce, American Support for Mussolini in the Mythology of the Corporate State, in which I analyzed Mussolini's corporate state. I compared various features, economic and political features of Mussolini's corporate state, and in turn compared Mussolini's corporate state and the economy that was created by it with the economy under Ronald Reagan and George Bush. Then in January of 1995, Arthur Miller penned the following remarks in the San Francisco Chronicle almost 5 years after I did that archive show, which, by the way, is available from archives on audio and which has been played on Roy Tuckman's show. Arthur Miller, after speaking in a satirical vein, goes on to say, "Some will object that such a system of what might be called legalized corruption would leave out the public and its interests. But this is no longer a problem when you realize that there is no public, and therefore no public interest in the old sense. Possible objections. The abstract idea of justice would disappear under a system that takes only private economic interests into account. Secondly, the corporate state, which this resembles, was Mussolini's concept and resulted in the looting of the public by private interests empowered by the state. Objection to the objections. We already have a corporate state. All privatization would do would be to recognize it as a fact. Conclusion. We are in bad trouble. Amen. I agree with that analysis completely. The whole point, and this is not to blow my own horn, but the whole point of Uncle Sam and Il Duce was that we do indeed have a corporate state, that the political and economic realities that were refined, not invented or brought upon us, but that were refined and fitted, I guess you could say, to the contemporary world by Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and the powers behind them, are identical with the political and economic realities that underlay Mussolini's corporate state. And the corporate state is going to be one of the points of departure in terms of the direction of analysis this evening. Beyond that, the very next day, appropriately enough, Friday, January 13th of 1995, in the very same place, as a matter of fact, on the op-ed page of the San Francisco Chronicle, there was a column by Deborah Saunders of the San Francisco Chronicle, a very conservative political analyst. Usually she serves as a shill for the far right. Here, however, she makes some comments in which she extrapolates not only on the recent flap concerning the Los Angeles chapter of the Mensa newsletter, which came out with some articles advocating eugenics and euthanasia and the building of a master race, very much along the lines of what Hitler advocated in Germany. Then Deborah Saunders goes on to ruminate about American society and its values, and comes up with some conclusions that are very similar to the line of speculation that I have been engaging in concerning the drift in the direction of euthanasia and the American euthanasia program, or incipient euthanasia program, and the history of eugenics, the international mental hygiene, and the international eugenics movements, which I discussed in my last lecture down here in November, and which figure very strongly in the background of such seemingly disparate phenomena as the best-selling book, The Bell Curve, a horrible piece of science, but one which is, I guess you could say, ringing true for a lot of people, despite the fact that it's readily verifiable BS. The eugenics, euthanasia question also looms very large in the background of such phenomena as Proposition 187, which had strong backing from the same sorts of eugenics advocates that had backed Adolf Hitler and that are pushing things in a similar direction in the United States. Deborah Saunders ruminated about the comments in the Mensa newsletter, and she entitled her column, Death Instead of Taxes. Of course, there's an old cliche that something is as sure as death and taxes. Here, however, she has corrupted that slightly and has entitled, as I said, her column, Death Instead of Taxes. If we were to take the word taxes in the context that Deborah Saunders is using it in this column, and to perhaps dolly back, draw the camera back, and assign a larger framework of meaning to the word taxes, instead of referring to taxes in the most narrow literal sense, if we are perhaps to see the term taxes here as representing, quote, wasteful government spending, unquote, the sort of, quote, liberalism, note the quotes, that Newt Gingrich and company are inveighing against, and the sort of, quote, wasteful big government, unquote, that we are now told that Newt Gingrich and company are going to free us from. I think that what we are likely to be seeing in the future is a transition from what is essentially a relatively benign or even a benevolent social system, and granted, this society is rife with injustice, deep, centuries-old injustice. But as I said earlier, there's nothing like stepping in a cow flop to make you realize how nice tripping over a stone can be. And when you hear Newt Gingrich or Oliver North or one of the Tyrannosaurus Rexes of the new right now ascendant in the United States referring to Bill Clinton as a, quote, leftist, unquote, or even a communist, unquote, when you hear the Democratic Party being described as a bunch of, quote, leftists, unquote. I think one should not fail to understand that to the people who are running things and the people who are likely to be structuring our lives in a fundamental way in the future, Bill Clinton is indeed a leftist. The Democratic Party are indeed, quote, communists, because to a Nazi, a conservative would be seen as a communist. And Bill Clinton is basically a conservative. He's a conservative Southern Democrat. But compared to what's coming, he's going to look like Karl Marx himself, somebody for whom I do not hold a brief. But let's just say, as Ronald Reagan said at the beginning of his second term, you ain't seen nothing yet. He probably doesn't remember saying that right now. You know, see, the old vaudeville line, you know, hey, have you heard Ronald Reagan has Alzheimer's? How can you tell? But Ronnie is out of the picture. But though the song is over, the malady will linger on. And I think that what we are going to be seeing in the future, the world to come, will indeed be presenting us with death instead of taxes. In other words, basically, instead of this wasteful big government spending, you know, the welfare state, and all the sort of hoo-ha that we're hearing from Gingrich and company, flat out, people are going to be eliminated. And those who aren't eliminated are going to be made to think that 2 plus 2 equals 5, one way or another. So death instead of taxes could have, in a sense, been the title of the lecture this evening, because that is how they're going to balance the budget, folks. They're not going to provide social services. They're going to get rid of people that either won't do without or clamor too loudly for the social services which they either never received or used to receive but won't be receiving anymore. Nope, they're going to get death instead of taxes. Reading from the San Francisco Chronicle of Friday, January 13th of 1995. Quote, "We better face the fact that we have to kill people," Kern County Attorney Jason G. Brent told the Los Angeles Times. "There are not unlimited amounts of resources," unquote. Brent was defending a controversial article he had written for the monthly newsletter of the Los Angeles chapter of Mensa, the High IQ Society. In it, Brent wrote, quote, "Society must face the concept that we kill off the old, weak, the stupid, and the inefficient." Well, if they kill off the stupid and the inefficient, that's going to be the end of not only the Republican Party, but most of the Washington political establishment. So don't hold your breath about that happening. But I think that the comments here by Jason Brent should not be seen as the rantings and ravings of some pretentious, super-intellectual twit. Let me read more. Another Mensa contributor, John Evans, wrote that many homeless, quote, "should be humanely done away with, like abandoned kittens," unquote. And again, quoting, "A piece of meat in the shape of a man but without a mind is not a human being, whether the body be deathly ill, damaged by accident, mentally blank because of brain deficiency," read in here the bell curve, read in here, quote, "niggers," unquote, or any of the, quote, special interests, unquote, that are perceived as ruining the United States. And as I've said in past lectures and broadcasts, forgive my use of strong language, but one should never mistake how the people in power in this country are thinking, and that's exactly how they are thinking. Continuing, quote, "A piece of meat in the shape of a man, but without a mind, is not a human being, whether the body be deathly ill, damaged by accident, mentally blank because of brain deficiency, or criminally insane," unquote. The reaction in and outside of Mensa has been one of shock and horror. Likening the infirm to blobs of meat is ominously reminiscent of the Nazi term "useless eaters," unquote, which justified Nazi extermination of the sick. Want to know what the future of health care is going to be? It's going to be death instead of taxes. Continuing. Some of you may be tempted to dismiss this story as an anomaly, the stuff of twit geniuses so intoxicated with their IQs that they've turned stupid. Yet, the belief that it is better for others to die than be a burden is becoming increasingly common, right down to the part about kittens. January's American Spectator magazine features a commentary which first appeared in the Amherst Bulletin, written by the Reverend Donna Schaefer of the United Church of Christ. Schaefer wrote of how her cat killed off her own litter, then noted, quote, "While not arguing for infanticide, I have to argue at least the plausibility of withdrawing maternal care." Interrupting, I think that behind these remarks one can perhaps see the future of Newt Gingrich's Boys Town social agenda. where Newt Gingrich is talking about separating welfare mothers from their children and putting the children in institutions. The Nazi extermination programs under Tiergartenstrasse 4 involved the elaborate use of front organizations that were set up to care for these poor unfortunates who basically were enveloped in the Third Reich's bureaucracy. The T4, Tiergartenstrasse 4 program, was named after Tiergartenstrasse 4, the address of the German ministry under which the Nazi euthanasia program was begun. That led directly to the Third Reich's extermination programs. But people inquiring about their relatives, who by the time of the inquiry had already been dispatched, were simply shoved back and forth in the bureaucracy and told, go talk to so-and-so, and then in this manner, through deliberate bureaucratic obfuscation, the actual physical extermination of human beings was hidden. And one should never mistake the possible gravity of the thrust of comments like Newt Gingrich's, where saying, well, after two, or policies like that, well, after 2 years, if the mother doesn't have a job, we'll take away her children. What are they going to do with the kids next? Well, stick around. Quote, while not arguing for infanticide, I have to argue at least the plausibility of withdrawing maternal care. Pushing your children into a lake is hardly that. But Susan Smith, the South Carolina mom who killed her 2 sons by strapping them into her car and letting it roll into a lake, quote, was making an announcement. She couldn't care for her children. Instead of making their lives permanently miserable, she drowned them. There is a strange, cruel mercy in the act, unquote. And this, by the way, is from a Unitarian minister. Continuing. Last month, an elderly Florida couple worth $10 million was found dead in their Cadillac Eldorado. Richard Brown, 79, had suffered from arthritis and asthma. Helen Brown, 76, had Alzheimer's disease. In a note sent to their friends before their suicide, the Browns explained that they were killing themselves in part because the cost of their health care would, quote, consume a substantial amount of their money, our money, unquote, which they donated to the United Church of Christ Missions in order to, quote, help many young people throughout the world and who one day may be able to help many more, unquote. Rather than sadly renouncing this suicide as a tragic waste, their former pastor, Charles Heuser, H-E-U-S-E-R, told the Associated Press that the Browns, quote, were taking the high road to death, unquote. Heuser, by the way, said he was the guy who persuaded the Browns to leave their money to the church. I guess... what's that? Yeah. Oh, that is not United... Oh. Okay, then what is the United Church of Christ? Educate me about Protestant denominations. Oh, I thought that was the Unitarians. No, okay. I stand corrected. Totally different. Well, all righty. My agnosticism is showing its underpinnings here, I suppose. That's what I thought, but then again, I've thought the same thing about a number of institutions, which turned out to be not nearly as progressive as I had thought. Continuing. In November, Oregon voters approved Measure 16, a physician-assisted suicide initiative. Before the election, the opposition campaign asked likely voters this question. If you knew that as a result of the pressure to contain health care costs, a doctor might encourage a terminally ill patient to choose physician-assisted suicide over more expensive treatment, would you favor or oppose, unquote? 36% said they would favor. Blame it on the deficit, high taxes, or a rotting culture, or D, this says Dave Emory, all of the above. But a growing number of Americans view others as a liability they would just as soon terminate. Assisted suicide advocates seem to believe that this country is so moral that there is no reason to fear the misuse of assisted suicide. But when a minister defends maternal abandonment as being, quote, as regular people say, for the best, unquote, while another lauds a couple's suicide, where is compassion for the young or the aged? When more than a third of voters would rather save money than heal the sick, don't bet on America's reverence for life. I think there is much food for thought in that particular column, as there was in Arthur Miller's column the previous day. I would also note, perhaps it's irrelevant, but I think we should take note of this because this lecture again was entitled "The Future Technology, Theocracy, and the 1,000-Year Reich." Reich. Note that the editorial comment being scored by Deborah Saunders in that column was being offered up by two people of the cloth, one male, one female. Two ministers were endorsing this merciful act, i.e. murder and suicide, which under traditional religious values, those are not values that are seen as being merciful and humanitarian. I think that the thrust of those two columns, on the one hand, the fact that we already have a corporate state. Mussolini, the world's first fascist, when queried by reporters as to what fascism meant, gave two one-word definitions. Mussolini said, and he was the world's first fascist who invented not only the political system but also the term to describe it. Mussolini said, fascism is reaction. And beyond that, he said, fascism is corporatism. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to briefly sum up what it was that Mussolini was driving at, because the corporate state and corporatism, I think, in many ways is going to be the raison d'etre, the reason why technology and theocracy are going to be used to establish the 1,000-year Reich. That 1,000-year Reich will be the corporate state, or will be created and sustained for and to a large extent by the corporate state. So I think it's worth understanding what the corporate state means. And this will be, to a certain extent at least, a slight oversimplification. However, it's basically accurate. When you're at work and your boss tells you to do something, you don't say, let's vote on it. You do it, basically. Now, if you have a good boss and you work for a good company, hopefully they consult with you before making important decisions. But basically, the way it works in the workplace is when your boss tells you to do something, you say how much, how high, and what color. You do it. You don't say, well, I want to vote on it. Now, let's subject this to democratic process. Democracy has nothing to do with it. You do as you are told. Mussolini felt that a society should be set up along the lines of power administration that exists within a corporation. Basically, when the boss says do something, you do it. Period. You don't vote on it. You do as you are told. Beyond that, the economic rationalization, and it was exactly that underlying Mussolini's corporate state, was that if the corporations benefited, if a society was set up in such a way as to benefit the corporations, this would automatically benefit everybody in the society, because as the corporations benefited and prospered, the wealth would trickle down to all of those happy little creatures that were toiling so blissfully away in the workplace in order to make those corporations work. Basically, Mussolini was proposing supply-side economics, or what George Bush, in a rare moment of lucidity, termed during the 1980 campaign voodoo economics. The basic features of Mussolini's corporate state were identical to the supply-side economics of Ronald Reagan and George Bush, and they did not work. As George Seldes, arguably America's foremost investigative journalist, said when describing what Mussolini's system actually produced, he said, quote, that fascism is a, quote, spoil system, unquote. Basically, it benefited the rich got richer, and everybody else suffered. In order to counteract the effects of this organized, institutionalized piracy on the rest of Italian society, Mussolini engaged in juggling the books, just like Ronald Reagan and George Bush counted monies that were set aside for Social Security to help make the deficits they were running up appear much smaller than in fact they were. Mussolini borrowed a tremendous amount of capital from abroad, primarily from American lending institutions, in order to balance the books. That's what Reagan and Bush did. That's why, even though the U.S. was the world's biggest creditor nation from 1917 through 1980, Ronald Reagan had turned us into a debtor nation by 1983, into the world's biggest debtor nation by 1985. National debt was a little over $900 billion when Jimmy Carter left office in 1980. When Ronald Reagan left in 88, it was $2.6 trillion, or almost 3 times as high. George Bush, within 4 years, had put it up over $4 trillion. In 1993, the interest on the national debt was $212 billion, almost 25% of what the entire national debt was when Ronald Reagan took office. Just like Mussolini, Ronald Reagan and George Bush borrowed capital abroad to help keep the society going, rather than even sinking that capital into the industrial base in order to expand it and create jobs, thereby stimulating spending, stimulating economic production, stimulating tax revenues and beginning to reduce the deficit. Mussolini sunk the money into he sunk it basically into military-related heavy industry in order to build up a huge military, which then also needed some sort of justification. That's why Mussolini invaded Ethiopia. He built up this huge military, hadn't done anything else in society, and he had to find some sort of justification for it, so in he went into Ethiopia. Ronald Reagan and George Bush, of course, did the same thing. This borrowed money was not used to expand American industry, but rather to build up a huge, huge military. Corporatism, the corporate state, was a failure in Mussolini's Italy. It was a failure in Ronald Reagan and George Bush's America, and it's going to be an even bigger failure in Newt Gingrich and Bob Dole's America, which is going to be so grim that Bob Dole is actually emerging as a moderating force within the Republican Party. Now think about that. There's something that ought to scare the you-know-what out of you. As blues singer Taj Mahal said, man, if you ain't scared, you ain't right. And if Bob Dole is a moderating influence, boy, I'd hate to see somebody who is a political extremist. But stick around, you're going to be seeing that. The corporate state doesn't figure to be any more successful in the future than it has been in the past, and it has been an absolute unqualified disaster in the past. And corporatism is the literal battle cry that we are now hearing sounded throughout the political corridors in the United States, and indeed all over the world. I think that the world to come, this technologically based fascist theocracy, which is what I think is going to evolve worldwide over the years and it may be centuries, that society is going to grow up in response to a fundamental conflict, and that is a fundamental conflict that I think is already evident. It is the conflict which is going to cause the corporate state, that corporate state which, as Arthur Miller has noted in this column, is already here, to basically give us, as Deborah Saunders has said, death instead of taxes. That is going to be the answer to health care. That is going to be the answer to cutting back on social services. That is going to be the answer to deficit reduction. A lot of deficits are going to be reduced. And very, very serious deficits they are. But the conflict that exists between, on the one hand, the needs of the corporate state, and on the other hand, the needs of A, the individual, and B, the ecosystem itself, at the risk of sounding a little bit corny. As the world's population has expanded, there has been an increasing pressure on the world's corporations, on the corporations which make up the corporate state, to meet the needs of the masses of humanity. They have not done a particularly good job. The number of have-nots in the world is increasing. Worldwide, in the United States and elsewhere, there is a pattern. And by the way, one of the things that I'm necessarily going to have to do in the talk tonight, and this is an example, is to move quickly, much more quickly than I would like, over some very, very broad and important points of information. In discussing world macroeconomics, that is the subject for an entire lecture series or a program in graduate work. I'm going to have to cover it in a matter of a few minutes this evening. So if aspects of the discussion seem somewhat facile under the circumstances, again, the limitations of time, the enormity of the subject are the excuses for which that I will offer up in asking your indulgence under the circumstances. But as the world's population has increased, the pressures on the corporate state have increased as well. On the one hand, there is a growing number of people on the earth who want basically a decent life. They want to be able to earn enough money to support themselves and their families. They want the basic needs that are required to support human existence. Food, clothing, shelter, medical care, education. Basically, if they don't necessarily want what we think of in the United States as the American dream, they want something which, at the very least, is not the world's nightmare. The corporate state, on the other hand, is dedicated to making profits. That is the raison d'etre of a corporation. It is the raison d'etre of the corporate state, is to maximize profits for the corporations. Theoretically, and it is just that, a theory and not a reality, those profits would then trickle down, Well, that didn't happen in Mussolini's corporate state, didn't happen in Ronald Reagan and George Bush's corporate state, and I sure as hell wouldn't hold my breath and expect it to happen under the corporate state of Newt Gingrich or Bob Dole, and I certainly wouldn't sit around and hold my breath and expect it to happen under the corporate state of the future, which is very likely to be administered by Darth Vader or somebody very much like him. The corporation needs profits. The individual wants a decent environment. They want the aspects of the, quote, good life that I have already discussed that necessarily will involve at least a reasonable compensation for their work, for the labor that they sell in the marketplace of labor. Beyond that, in order to maintain a decent, a viable human existence, both for oneself and for one's family, the ecosystem itself has to have its integrity maintained. If you're dumping toxic chemicals into your water supply, if you're eroding the ozone layer, if you're melting the ice caps, if you're cutting down the rainforests, which represent literally the lungs of the earth, if you're pouring heavy metals into the ocean, if you're spraying pesticides all over your produce and putting them into your soil and spouting hydrocarbons and other residual from fossil fuels into the atmosphere, sooner or later what goes around comes around. You are literally setting the stage for the physical termination of life on this planet, human life possibly among the life forms that will become extinct. The corporation profits, for the corporation I should say, and for the corporate state, profits are what matters. And the fact of the matter is that at least in the short run, in the view of the corporate state, profits will be maximized by minimizing or eliminating altogether environmental regulations, which cost money to implement. Now, over the long haul, poisoning the earth and poisoning one's workforce, not to mention oneself, is not profitable. It isn't even very bright. But the fact of the matter is, in the short run, it does make more sense to the profit-minded to dump the toxic waste into the nearest stream rather than process it and sinking investment capital or sinking capital which one might put in one's own bank account into seeing to it that the toxic waste isn't dumped into the water supply. The corporation makes more profits in the short run by paying the workers as little as possible, by not providing health care for the workers. Now, again, over the long haul, despoiling one's workforce, so to speak, is also detrimental to the long-term interests of the corporate state. It's one of the reasons why it doesn't work. But in the short run, the corporate state is going to see to it that the amount of money, the amount of capital paid out in compensation for the labor that it requires and the amount of capital allocated to clean up the environment are minimized. Because the less capital that is allocated to the cleaning up of the environment and the sustenance of the ecosystem, and the less capital that is laid out in order to compensate the workforce for the labor that they contribute, the greater will be the profits. The greater will be the bank accounts of the people who are running the corporate state. For that reason, we already have a fundamental, irrevocable conflict in this society between the needs of the individual and the needs of the planet itself, and the short-term perceived needs, please note the use of the term perceived, of the corporate state. I do not think that overall it would be impossible to set up a corporate structure that would be mutually adaptable to the needs of an individual and of the planet itself, but the fact of the matter is the corporate state and the way in which corporatism has evolved, they are not in harmony with the interests of the individual and the ecosystem, and that is why we are going to be getting death instead of taxes in the world that is coming. This in my opinion. Now again, I don't know exactly when some of the things that I'm talking about are going to manifest themselves. What I'm going to be discussing for the rest of the evening are the trends that I think things are going to be taking, the direction that I think things are going to be taking, and how the direction that things are moving in now is going to play itself out in the future. The conflict between the needs of the corporate state and the corporate states, by the way, one of the nice things about a small venue like this is that there are people who are taping, and many are. Just stick up your hand and I can pause for a minute while you turn over your tape. The features of this technologically based fascist theocracy that I see evolving as the system of government in the world to come, again, grows out of what I see as the fundamental, irrevocable conflict between the needs of the individual and the needs of the planet itself, and the perceived short-term needs of the corporate state, i.e. maximized profits. I do not think that this growing number of people on this earth and the system which seeks greater and greater profits are going to be able to find a satisfactory resolution, or satisfactory from the standpoint of basic decent civilization. Rather, I think the resolution, and there will be a resolution, will be an extremely catastrophic one. I think that we are headed for a planet-wide and species-wide catastrophe of unprecedented and, to most people, frankly, unimaginable proportions. What is coming is going to be a tragedy that is going to make the excesses of the Third Reich look like a kindergarten. In fact, the excesses of the Third Reich in many ways could be viewed as something of a dress rehearsal for the world to come. The course of human behavior, and indeed the basic motivation of the human animal, and here again is a portion of tonight's talk in which I'm going to be addressing some very large and profound realities, and doing so in a much smaller period of time than they really should be addressed. So once again, this might seem a little facile, and I will ask your indulgence under the circumstances because of that. Psychologists view human life itself as being governed by and driven by, well, really a great many things, but above all else, two principles. Those principles are basically the pleasure principle and the reality principle. To make a very long story very short, the pleasure principle and the reality principle interact. They are very closely related. The reality principle, well, let me start with the pleasure principle. Well, basically, it's a simple concept. What the pleasure principle entails is that people will do what makes them feel good. Now, that seems like a pretty simple thing to grasp. Obviously, you do what makes you feel good. You'll sit in a nice, comfortable chair. You will not hold your hand over a blowtorch. Okay, the one hurts. That will not feel good. Sitting on a nice soft couch or eating a nice meal or enjoying a nice day in the country, that's a nice thing. You will seek to do what makes you feel good. All creatures do this. If you take a rat, you put it in a Skinner box, and on the one side of the Skinner box is a plate of food. On the other hand is a grid in which you administer electric shocks. The rat is going to go for the food rather than the electric shock. It's going to do what makes it feel good. It will also do, at least up to a point, what sustains it on this earth. What the reality principle entails is basically doing, acting in concert with one's environment in such a way as to realize the pleasure principle. Now, if you're sitting in a room, and again, this is something of an oversimplification, if you're sitting in a room and there's something in the room that annoys you, say, just by way of example, each of you were sitting on a sharp tack, okay? The pleasure principle is going to motivate you in such a way as to eliminate that pain. That is literally a pain in the expletive deleted under the circumstances, okay? The reality principle will drive you to basically find some way of removing that irritation. Since sitting on that sharp tack is painful, since you are governed by the pleasure principle, you're going to do something to avoid the pain of sitting on that tack. In most cases, you're going to get up and you're going to remove the damn thing from the seat of your pants. I guess you could say that would be the plan of attack under the circumstances. In the corporate state, they're going to have to figure out, and I think they are already figuring out, ways of convincing you that instead of getting up and removing that tack from your derriere, you are going to have to learn to enjoy that tack. Something is going to have to be done to get you to keep sitting on that tack because, and to extend the metaphor, to develop the metaphor, that tack really is death instead of taxes. That represents what the corporate state requires, which is minimizing your compensation and consequently what you are going to be able to do in terms of acquiring creature comforts, education, housing, clothing, shelter, whatever. The less they are able to compensate you for your labor, then the more profitable things are going to be for them and for the corporate state in the short run. By the same token, the less they have to devote towards cleaning up the environment. And we are in bad shape right now. If we do not change the direction we're moving in, I think, barring moving out into space, which I think eventually we will attempt to do, successfully or otherwise, we are dead meat. We are basically fouling our nest, and we will pay. We're already paying for that, but we will pay dearly in the future. Since it is in the interest of the corporate state to keep you sitting on that tack, they are going to have to find some way of getting you to accept sitting on that tack. And it is by way of convincing humanity to stay seated on that tack that the system of government or the system of social administration that I see coming will evolve. And that will involve the interaction of a number of different things to basically convince you to stay seated on the tack. A number of things are already being done, and I think are likely to be done to a greater extent in the future, to make you feel that you have no choice but to sit on the tack. Now, obviously in the short run, some of the things that are being used to convince people to sit on the tack, these are things that are already in evidence, and I think we can assume that these things will continue to exist, that they will be heightened and refined in the world to come. Now, on the one hand, the media and the educational system itself are used to convince people that, in fact, what is bad is good. People are propagandized and misinformed. They're told by Mount Limbaugh, for example, that, in fact, the ozone layer is not really disappearing and that it's okay to cut down rainforests and that really there's nothing to worry about. This is a way of telling you, hey, listen, don't worry about that sensation in your derriere. That is really something good. It's just all those liberals and those Democrats and all those sissies who are convincing you that that is a bad feeling. It's really a good feeling, and it's all American. You should learn to love it. That is not a sharp pain from a piece of metal stabbing into your flesh. That's called conservatism. That's called good government. So keep sitting on that tack and learn to love it, because it's really a good thing. By the way, I heard a really nice comedian's observation about Mr. Limbaugh. He was comparing Rush Limbaugh with the Hindenburg, and said, but of course, it is unfair to compare a flaming Nazi gas bag with a magnificent airship. So I think that is something we should bear in mind. But the media are used to propagandize us. We're told that Mobil Oil and Exxon, they don't really pollute the environment. You'll see a nice little thing with a bunch of little koala bears, and they live on a little Chevron refinery somewhere, and, way the hell out in Australia, and, do people really set up things in such a way as this little cutesy koala bear can climb up this tree? Yes, people do. It's Exxon, nice fuzzy little Exxon like your fuzzy little teddy bear. So don't worry about it when the refinery down the road blows up or pours poison into your kids' Wheaties. It's really a good thing. Just think about that little koala bear that we're saving down in Australia, and don't worry about the medical bills you're paying for your child's cancer care. It's really okay. The educational system functions in a similar fashion. People go to college. They are not told about the corporate state. They're not told about how Henry Ford and Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles and Standard Oil of New Jersey and International Harvester and IT&T and an awful lot of other things that provide for the world they live in supported Hitler. They supported Mussolini. They thought it was great. They liked the corporate state. They're told no instead. Once upon a time there was a bad man named Adolf Hitler who hypnotized all the Germans and made them all go crazy, and they had a big war, and then along came the Allies and made everything wonderful again, or everything would have been wonderful again, but along came another bad man named Joseph Stalin, hypnotized all the Russians, made them all go crazy, and then they had the Cold War. Well, we won that too, just like we won World War II, so everything is wonderful. Eat your Wheaties with the petrochemicals in them, and don't worry about a thing. In addition to the educational system and the media, also the various religions, not all of them necessarily, but religion also contributes substantively to the creating of a society in which people can be convinced to sit on the tack. And I think that what we're going to be seeing in the future is a system in which a number of the things that we are seeing now and the things that we are seeing some of now and are going to see a whole lot more of later are going to be used to convince us to sit on the tack. Another way, of course, of convincing people to sit on the tack, if people don't like the idea of sitting on a sharp tack because it hurts, then you have some 6'5" 320-pound guard with a submachine gun and a furnace full of hot irons and a rack to convince you that you may not like sitting on that tack, but there's something much, much worse. So keep sitting on the tack or we'll take you up here and we'll burn you with hot irons, which is going to feel a whole lot worse than that. In other words, intimidation, totalitarianism, fascism, totalitarianism put to work at the service of the corporate state. I think intimidation, raw intimidation, and intimidation by induction will be used. Certainly they're being used now, and they will be used in the world to come to assure that people stay seated on the tack. If you yourself may not be facing a big Alfredo with his submachine gun and his hot irons, you will have seen what happened to, if not your next door neighbor, somebody down the block who tried to get up off the tack and instead was beaten within an inch of their life, had their arms and legs broken, and then were tortured with hot irons, and then had their kids taken away to an orphanage. So that you will not be inclined to do the same thing. As bad and as painful as sitting on that tack may be, there's something worse, and this will be made quite clear to you. So stay seated on the tack and enjoy it. I think that another very important factor in getting people to sit on the tack, and this is something that I think we are seeing now and we're going to be seeing a lot more of as the world develops, and that is religion itself. I found it very significant that Deborah Saunders in that column, and she is right-wing as hell, she's very, very conservative, that she focused on the comments of two ministers basically endorsing the drift towards mass extermination, which we are witnessing in this society. Another very good way of getting people to stay seated on the tack is to convince them that suffering is a blessing. That the longer they sit on that tack and the fewer tears they shed from a lifetime of sitting on that tack, the greater will be their chances of getting into heaven. That even though it might hurt sitting on that tack, don't worry about it, because eventually some deity or some higher interest ultimately will reward you for sitting on that tack. The old labor movement in the early part of the century, we refer to that as pie in the sky. There'll be pie in the sky by and by. So don't worry basically about the fact that you're getting reamed out. You, I think, are witnessing, to a certain extent at least, a manifestation of this technologically, if not technologically based, technologically enhanced fascist theocracy already. Here in the United States, one of the foundations of the, quote, new right, unquote, it's really the old right, it's really Mussolini's corporate state, however, with a happy face painted on. One of the foundations of the power base of Newt Gingrich, Bob Dole and company is the Christian right. People are being told basically that it's okay to despoil the environment. In fact, James Watt, Ronald Reagan's first Secretary of the Interior, when asked about what he planned to do about all the pressing problems that were besetting the earth, about the problems which threatened to destroy human life later on in the century if they weren't corrected. And he said, well, basically, I can't remember his exact words. He said basically, well, Jesus is going to be coming anyway, so the world is going to end, so why worry about the environment? In the Santa Clara Valley, the much ballyhooed Silicon Valley, which is where I live and work, there is a very large population of born-again Christians, and this is not in any way to belittle any individual or their religion. I'm going to extrapolate from reactionary Christianity in just a minute and extrapolate from that even more later in the discussion. But there are a lot of born-again Christians in the Santa Clara Valley, which also, not incidentally, is the epicenter of the defense electronics industry. That is an area that was so strategically sensitive in the 1980s that no Soviet citizen was allowed within a 40-mile radius by our intelligence services. My nickname for it was not the Silicon Valley, but the Valley of the Shadow of Death, because the defense industry was basically what the Santa Clara Valley was all about. In the early 80s, I had a second job in addition to my regular day job, working part-time at a retail outlet. And there was a woman who used to come in frequently with her family and her kids to buy this, that, and the other thing. And she worked at Lockheed Missiles and Space in Sunnyvale, which manufactured, among other things, the ICBMs for the Trident submarine. And she used to come in. She was a serious born-again Christian and was always handing out prayer cards and quoting scripture and trying to convert me or anybody else who would listen. And most often, not always, but most often, she would, at least during the cooler weather, she would wear a Trident windbreaker. In other words, on the back it would say Trident in big, bold, yellowish-orange letters, and it was a blue windbreaker. And here she was. It was a very grotesque spectacle to me. Here she was talking about the Prince of Peace and espousing world Christian fellowship, while she was advertising on the back the product of her employer, which was a device which would destroy, if ever used, would destroy all human life on this earth. I've forgotten how many cities each Trident submarine could destroy, but one Trident submarine, I think, could destroy every major city in the Soviet Union. Those were some awesome weapons that those things were sporting and are sporting. And when one considers that one of the commandments or one of the edicts that the Christians are supposedly adhering to is what God hath wrought, let no man tear asunder. And here are these people busily earning their livings, building machines that would tear everything God, quote, wrought, unquote, asunder. And I asked her about the conflict, or what I obviously saw as a conflict, between worshiping the Prince of Peace and yet advertising the gods of war on across one's back. And she saw no conflict whatsoever. She said, well, these are the last days, so it really isn't going to matter if there's a nuclear war. It really won't matter because, Jesus is coming back. That is how you get people to sit on the tack, folks, is you convince them that there is a higher meaning to sitting on that tack. And if they sit on that tack long enough, then they'll become saints. We are also seeing something, by the way, as has been the case frequently in past lectures. We're honored this evening by the presence of a very fine human being and a very stalwart political crusader, someone that I think is perhaps in a position to appreciate some of what I'm saying better than most, namely Farah Mansour, a very heroic member of the Iranian resistance who has done landmark work on the Islamic fundamentalist movement, primarily in Iran but also elsewhere. And Farah's research has pointed out, and I think made the case inarguably, that despite the appearances to the contrary, the United States and Britain, as well as to a lesser extent Germany, had actually backed the fundamentalist Muslims who are in power in Iran and elsewhere, and that reactionary fundamentalist Islam, like reactionary fundamentalist Christianity, has received the good blessings and the active, tactical, and strategic support of the very same national security and corporatist elements in this country that really lie at the core of the corporate state that I'm talking about. And the conditions under which people live in areas where the Islamic fundamentalists have achieved power, well, those conditions are horrible. And it is my opinion, and by the way, perhaps during the question and answer session, Farah can he can elaborate on this or disagree with me if he does, but I think that in areas of the third world, I think Islam is being envisioned as a force similar to reactionary Christianity. Convince the peasantry that wretchedness is a blessing and that their real reward will lie in the next lifetime. You can get them to acquiesce and basically spend a whole lifetime sitting on that tack, or perhaps even prostrating themselves on that tack in the direction of Mecca 5 times a day. Beyond that, I think there is an indication that yet another form of religion may very well be utilized to help get us sit on that tack. By the way, I want to stress that I'm not dumping on anyone's individual religious preferences. I take every individual and every individual's religious views as they come. So when I talk about the New Age, it's a very broad term and it applies to a lot of different things. I don't want people to take this personally, but I have a fair amount of experience with New Age culture, which oddly enough is very prevalent in the Santa Clara Valley, just as is born-again Christianity. One of the radio stations I work at in the Bay Area in particular has a very large New Age contingent and plays a lot of New Age music and has a lot of New Age talk shows. And the New Age itself, it's a very broad term. One could perhaps, in fact, some people would see things as relatively conventional as yoga or acupuncture as being, quote, New Age, unquote. I'm rather talking about some religious and, quote, spiritual, unquote, orientations, which I think are at best questionable and which I think beyond that represent something of an antechamber, some of them anyway, to fascism. We should not lose sight of the fact that Nazism itself had a very strong degree of overlap with the occult. In fact, the inner core of the Nazi Party per se evolved from a pan-German occult society called the Thule Society, and that at the inner core of the SS philosophy was an explicit occult, an anti-Semitic, pan-German occultism. There are strong elements of the occult which are explicitly fascistic or at the very best proto-fascistic. I have seen a degree of overlap, and in fact Arianna Huffington embodies that overlap between a New Age religion and outright fascism, and indeed Ms. Huffington, whom I'm making a point of addressing very politely if this lecture should ever be played on the air. Ms. Huffington is a very interesting individual. I would note that the same reactionary Christians who should be totally rejecting someone who's been following John Roger were very comfortable that she in fact was a sister in Christ. I think there is a fair amount of overlap between some elements of the New Age religious and philosophical movement and things which could be at best described as proto-fascistic. Beyond that, I've seen in my own experiences with some New Age philosophy not only a proto-fascist orientation, but a dangerously unrealistic orientation, which I think, again, is something that would incline a human being towards remaining seated on that sharp tack and convincing themselves that, in fact, it was very, quote, spiritual, unquote, to sit on that tack and to deny oneself, perhaps. There was a talk show on the same radio station in Northern California that I work on, and they were having some charlatan, frankly, on there, and it was a New Age call-in talk show, and they were kicking around a bunch of BS, and one caller, to his credit, called up the host and this jerk that he had as a guest. And the basic thrust of the discussion was that we were headed for a golden age, and in the next century we're all going to live in a golden age and everything is going to be wonderful. By the way, strong elements of fascism. An Italian Nazi philosopher named Julius Evola specifically saw the end result of fascism as a, quote, golden age, unquote, in which human existence would be so purified that people wouldn't even have to think. They could just wish things true. This is very similar to some elements, I say some elements of New Age philosophy and New Age religion. Anyway, the thrust of this show is that we're all headed to a golden age and that everything is going to be just wonderful. And a guy called up and said, what do you mean we're headed for a golden age? Things are horrible. He said, look at all the horrible things around us. How about the destruction of the ozone layer? How do you see that as consistent with a golden age and increased spirituality on the earth? No problem, said the guest. He said that actually we not only shouldn't worry about the destruction of the ozone layer, but actually it was a very good thing because purple was a very, very spiritual color. And that as the ozone layer disintegrated, it would increase the amount of ultraviolet radiation on the Earth, and this in turn would increase the spirituality on the Earth. Scouts Honor, this is what this hockey puck was saying on his show. And I'll say this, that this individual was right about one thing. If the ozone layer goes and we have no protection from the ultraviolet radiation, we're all going to be spirits. So that will increase the amount of spirituality on the Earth. But going back to the thrust of the discussion, I think this unfortunate individual, and I wish I could say that there weren't a fair number of that type of individual around, that is an individual who not only has been convinced to keep sitting on the tack, he's bloody well going to spend his time convincing other people to sit on the tack as well. And I think that New Age, some aspects of New Age religion clearly anticipate a pro-fascist, pro-corporatist, theocratic approach. Basically, if you are not drawn to reactionary Christianity or, say, reactionary Islam, You can be convinced by Guru Bhagwan Sri Panzafur to join the Holy Order of the Purple Beyond. And that is how they will convince you to sit on the tack. And Guru Panzafur will tell you, oh no, do not worry. Do not worry at all. I know that it feels very bad sitting on the tack at first, but Krishna in all of his wisdom has developed many, many different kinds of pleasure on this earth. And this particular kind of pleasure that you're experiencing right now is a type of pleasure that we call pain, you see. So as we above spiritually, do not worry about this particular form of pleasure called pain, because Krishna has intended you to learn to love pain, and that way when you experience the higher forms of pleasure beyond pain, then you will become even more highly evolved. And this is how you will make it to the 12th level of purple existence. Assuming that you meet the $500 fee, which I will collect from you at the intermission from my lecture. Thank you very much. And if that doesn't work, thank you. Does somebody want to collect my $500 fee, by the way? If that doesn't work, then I'll have Pastor Karl-Heinz Luftwaffe convince you that suffering is a blessing, and we should all place our faith in Jesus, because sooner or later, we all are going to have to shuffle off this mortal coil, so let us not pay too much attention to our travails on this vale of tears. Yes, I know that life is hard and life is painful, but it has been ordained for us to experience the reality of Jesus on the cross. Though the passion that he must have felt as they drove those nails into his skin. We think we have suffering. All you have to do is sit on a little tack. Think about what our Lord, when our God gave up his only Son, he had huge nails driven to his hands, and a crown of thorns placed upon his head, and a spear thrust into his side. And all we have to do is to sit on a small tack. Yes, we are blessed children, so let us pray. And while we are praying, I will pass around the collection plate, and please put your hard-earned wages into the collection plate so that we can all become tacky together. Okay? I'll tell you, I'm myself an agnostic. I can see certain aspects. I can see certain aspects of higher mathematics and physics that could indicate that there might be something beyond what is immediately evident. I don't worry about it because we all get there sooner or later. Some of us perhaps sooner than others. But I had the occasion to go to, and I don't want to offend any individual's religious beliefs. I had the occasion to go to a former roommate's funeral late last year. And he basically placed all of his faith in vodka. That's basically what he believes in. Which is going to get us to something else as we talk about mind control and the use of drugs and inebriants to get you to sit on the tack. Because if you don't get hoodwinked by Guru Bhagwan Sri Panzafur, or if you don't get inculcated by Pastor Karl-Heinz Luftwaffe, then basically, Brother Love on the corner is going to sell you a joint, a packet of heroin, a speedball or something like that, or else maybe just a gallon of, moonshine or whatever, and you just wipe yourself out, and you won't even feel the tax. So you'll stay seated on it because you're nodding out. But Jim was, shall we say, irreverent, except for everything. He was irreverent about everything except vodka, and that was ultimately what killed him. It was kind of a sad situation. But at his funeral, first of all, his sister was an absolute nutcase born-again Christian, and she delivered this interminable eulogy over her brother, talking about, oh, how wonderful it was, because now Jim was with Jesus. If Jim had been there, he would have puked. He never would have liked us, although he hated his sister, and the last thing he cared about was Jesus. But she went on and on. But it was a Catholic Mass, and it's been a long time since I had seen the Catholic communion, and the priest went on and on, droning on and on in this monotone about how this becomes the blood of Jesus, and this becomes his body, and our brother Jim shall be sanctified. It was on. It basically this act of totem cannibalism. That was really quite horrifying. And I, ever the cynic, frankly, was having a hard time suppressing giggles in the very back row. I was hoping that people thought I was crying and that I was actually trying to cover up laughter. But finally, at the end, the guy concluded the communion by saying, "And we take it, and we eat it." And I just dissolved. I said, "You got that right, pal."
You got at least that much right. And I ran out the back of the church and I roared like a big dog out in the parking lot for about 5 minutes. You know, you take it and you eat it. That is what is going to be happening under this fascist-oriented, technologically based theocracy. You're going to take it and you're going to eat it. And you're going to like it, too. And the fact that you will be sitting on the tack while you are chewing will really be the point. Because, again, this conflict between the needs of the corporate state and the needs of the individual and the planet itself are in a state of fundamental conflict. I think the dominant power element of the world today is the transnational corporation. I think even the nation state itself is in a state of obsolescence, and one of the things that I think is going to be happening is that larger countries are going to be balkanized, that ethnicity is going to be deliberately heightened so that peoples, first of all, they quarrel with each other and blame each other for the problems which in fact will be created by the corporate state. Here we're seeing people of color, for example, poor people and minorities being scapegoated for America's economic problems, hence the code word that really lies behind the call to reduce government spending. They're not talking about holding down government spending. It basically is a racist battle cry. It means let's get those niggers and Mexicans who are spending our hard-earned tax dollars on their welfare. That is not what's caused America's problems, not poor people, not people of color, but rather the corporate state. But people are going to be, since people are going to have to be convinced to sit on the tack, they will also be convinced that in fact the pain is not coming from that tack which is stuck into their rear end, but it's coming from the person in the seat behind them who is stabbing them. And so that if they want to cure their problems, they can turn around and stab the person in the seat behind them, and then they won't feel that pain. That's another way in which people are going to have to be, they are already being convinced to sit on the tack. I think that ethnicity will also be used to break up larger nation states to create less powerful and potentially less effective entities. Because the smaller a country is, the less powerful, the smaller a country is, the less powerful it is, and the less capable it will be of resisting some of these huge transnational corporations. I think that's another pattern that we will be seeing in the future. I think that technology itself will be utilized in combination with religion and totalitarianism to produce a number of effects that I'm going to be talking about in the second part of the discussion this evening. So one more thing I want to touch on, and I've already touched on it in the discussion, and that is another thing that is going to be used to convince people to sit on the tack, something that will be used to get them to adjust the conflict between the reality principle and the pleasure principle in such a way as to suit the needs of the corporate state. Remember, if you're sitting on a tack, the pleasure principle is going to drive you to get up off the tack because it hurts. Now, you can do that in a couple of ways. You can resolve that pain either by getting up off the tack or by somehow altering your internal environment in such a way as the pain no longer is perceptible to you. I've already cited some of the ways that can be done. Or in the case of intimidation, even though the pain may be perceptible, you will be convinced that you could experience a worse pain, so don't worry about that. Another way, of course, is to get people to literally submit themselves to narcosis. There is substantive evidence, overwhelming evidence, in fact, that to a considerable extent the, quote, drug problem, unquote, in this country and in other countries is being, if not deliberately created, at least actively aided and abetted by elements of the intelligence services and the national security establishment, which also are being employed in a law enforcement capacity to help to combat that very drug problem. There is substantive evidence that cocaine, heroin, and other forms of inebriants are being deliberately introduced into areas of American society, in particular inner city neighborhoods and neighborhoods inhabited by people of color, not only in order to help fund corporations in the foreign policy sphere, but also to basically keep the people in those neighborhoods and in those mini societies, so to speak, in a state of narcosis, to keep them drugged up, literally morphined out in such a way as they can endure that pain. Again, if you've been swilling vodka like my late ex-roommate, or if you've been shooting heroin or snorting cocaine or whatever, that's another way to get people to sit on the tack. Basically, when you're nodded over like this, you're not worried about the pain that you would be experienced by sitting on that tack because you're no longer conscious of the pain. Your central nervous system has been so chemically altered that you're no longer experiencing the receptors, the pain signals from your central nervous system. And that's another way to get people to sit on the tack, is to drug them out. One of the very first things that the Nazis would do, for example, upon occupying a country, is to drastically increase the price of food, but to hold the price of liquor roughly stable, so that it actually became a cheaper way for people who were poor to gain their calories by drinking beer or some other form of alcohol, rather than by going out and buying bread. So that way they at least were able to sustain themselves in a certain minimal sense by putting enough calories into themselves to keep going, at the same time as they were much less inclined to political activism and organization and resistance, because they were teetering down the street after drinking their dinner instead of eating it. By the way, what time is it now? 8:30. Would people like to take a break now? Because we're definitely going to have time. How many for a break now? Well, I think it's probably just over half. Why don't we take a short break now, and then I'll finish the second half of the lecture. We'll then have a short break before a question and answer session. But remember what we've heard so far, because so far they've been quite adept at getting people to sit on the tack. What we're going to talk about in the second part of the lecture is how, as the world turns, so to speak, how they're going to get people to sit on the tack when the tack becomes longer and sharper and more painful, because that's what it's going to do. Take a break, maybe 10 minutes or so, and then we'll continue with the discussion. If I could have your attention, time is marching on, and I'd like to put a wrap on the main part of the lecture so we have time for questions. Where I think things are going, as I indicated in the first part of the lecture, is I think can be deduced at least to a certain extent from where we are now and where things have been going in the past. I think that with an ecosystem that is disintegrating, and with, as I said, a fundamental conflict between the needs of the corporate state and the needs of the earth itself and the needs of the individual. By the way, this is not to diss private enterprise, so to speak. I think private enterprise works about 90% of the time, but it's that other 10% that gets out of control and results in corporatism or fascism. I think any form, the nature of the human animal is such that any form of unbalanced power will be abused. I think that's the nature of the human animal, and it can happen under socialism. As it happens, the system that has evolved as the dominant social system is industrial capitalism, and there has been no effective check provided for on either the power of the transnational corporations or the power of the U.S. and other major countries' national security establishments. I think as the Earth itself disintegrates, as the ozone layer disintegrates, as global warming, the destruction of the rainforest, the pollution of the oceans, the pollution of the air, the pollution of the streams, the poisoning of the food chain itself, as these things progress and make life increasingly unhealthy for human beings on the earth, as the number of human beings increases and as the concentration of wealth increases, the misery for the individual human being is going to increase. Therefore, in order to realize its goals, the corporate state in the future is going to have to devise methods of maintaining social control. Now, one of the things that is going to happen is that the conflict, the law of supply and demand, in effect, will be brought into play when you have far too many people for the number of jobs that are available. And again, as with the first part of the lecture, there are times in this lecture when I'm going to have to gloss over very complicated subjects relatively quickly, and it'll perhaps seem a little bit facile. In order to maximize profits, wages and benefits will be held down. The more people you have competing for any given job opening, the lower will be the wage and the greater the profit, because sooner or later they're going to get somebody to work that job for a low wage. The larger the number of people demanding jobs and the fewer jobs that there will be, relatively speaking, will result in an adjustment of the marketplace with regard to labor in accordance with the law of supply and demand. I do not expect industrial expansion to take place and provide jobs for whom there are no jobs. Rather, I think
those people who are deemed extra, those people who will no longer be central to either the production and or consumption phases of economic life, will be disposed of. I think that we are already seeing the beginning of this, and that is AIDS. Again, this is going to seem perhaps a bit crazy to people who are new to my work. I've done a lot of work in the past, specifically in Radio Free America program number 16, indicating that AIDS is not a naturally occurring disease, but rather represents the application of genetic engineering to the art or science, if one could call it that, of biological warfare. I think that excess population will be eliminated. I think various forms of technology and deception will be utilized. I think we are already seeing the beginnings of that with euthanasia, with the push to euthanasia. And I think that in a very real sense, if we take the Deborah Saunders column with which I began the lecture, and if we apply a larger meaning to the word taxes, meaning not specifically taxes, but rather social spending, the safety net, so to speak, that we all think about, then the death will indeed be presented as the alternative to taxes. The human animal is going to become more difficult to control as the conditions under which they are expected to live become harsher. In effect, basically, the tack that people will be asked to sit on is going to become sharper and longer and more difficult to endure. So as a result, the corporate state is going to have to devise more inventive and more effective ways of getting people to sit on the tack. One of the things that I see playing a large role in the corporate state of the future is technology. I think various forms of technology are going to be used in combination with each other. They will be used to eliminate people who are deemed undesirable, either people who are excess workers, i.e. unemployable, excess consumers, i.e. the homeless, that the Mensa newsletter is already advocating be disposed of, or people who are rebellious, people who insist on trying to get up off of that tack that they're supposed to sit on, or even worse, who are going to inform other people that they don't have to sit on that tack, or try to organize other people in such a way as to get them all to get up off of the tack. That will be the greatest danger of all, and I think a variety of things will be used to counteract that. Various forms of coercion have already been used. Deception and propaganda from the media, the educational system, existing religions, those are already being used. I think they will be used in the future. Intimidation is already being used. It will be used in the future. People who get in the way will be assassinated. Whole groups of people who get in the way will be coerced or deceived if possible, co-opted if possible, or eliminated if not possible. I think that the ultimate denial of the pleasure and reality principles will be to get people to do what in reality is unpleasant, by confusing and coercing them in such a way as to get them to experience the world in a very different fashion from the way the world actually exists. I've spoken in a number of archive shows about mind control, and by mind control I don't mean mass propaganda or mass deception. That is a form of controlling the human mind, but when I speak about mind control, I'm talking about the actual physical interference with the individual human intellect and perceptual system through the use of psychosurgery, hypnosis, classical and operant conditioning, and various other psychopharmacology and newer technologies. The state of the art with regard to mind control involves the use of various forms of electromagnetic radiation and also ultrasonics to produce a number of effects. Pulsed microwaves can be directed at the individual human cerebral cortex in such a way as the person to whom they are being subjected actually hears voices in their head. It's not known exactly why this effect is produced. It's believed that the microwaves actually set up corresponding waves in the fluid that is on the inside of the brain casing. It's been known that people who are deaf can actually be made to hear through the use of pulse microwaves. any one of us or all of us collectively could be made to hear a voice inside of our head by directing a microwave beam at us. I think in a society in which people are not informed that such a thing is possible, in a society, the society of the future, which I think will be, again, a technologically based fascist theocracy, a totalitarian system in which technology is used as the main trump card in order to get people to believe in a, quote, spiritual system, a religious and philosophical system, which in and of itself will be the main coercive device in getting them to accept the unacceptable and getting them to keep sitting on that tack. If you were not educated to the fact that pulse microwaves can make you hear voices, if in fact you had a relatively poor education, and the reduction of the educational system is already going on, and I think it is one of the major elements of control of the corporate states and of the national security state as well. It's one of the reasons why I do what I do. I read material on the air so that people can tape the programs and use the resulting tapes as an audio study resource, because education is important. I think in turn education will be used to deliberately blind people to the technological progress that is going on, and in turn to technologically blind them, blind them as a result to what is actually assailing them. I think that many of these technologies will be used to produce effects which will be attributed to, quote, spiritual entities. For example, if a population, if you want to control a given population, if you can subject them to pulsed microwaves so that they hear a voice, they could think that this was the voice, they could be told that this was the voice of God or of an angel or something else. I foresee the administration of this technologically based fascist theocracy as being undertaken by a class of spy priests, so to speak, to coin a phrase. Now, I realize that might seem like a mouthful under the circumstances. These will be people who will literally be intelligence agents. They will be spooks. They will be intelligence officers acting at the behest of whatever government is administering this particular manifestation of the corporate state. They also will be religious leaders. They will be spiritual leaders. They will be the ones who will be in the know about the various forms of technology that will be represented as supernatural phenomena to the masses who are to be controlled in such a way as to get them to continue to sit on that tack and to endure that pain. One of the things that I foresee happening is an increasing development in the sophistication of mind control and the representation of sophisticated mind control, the use of microwaves to produce, in addition, for example, to voices in the head, they can produce visual hallucinations with the clarity of 35 millimeter color slides. This is going on now. People can be subjected to electromagnetic radiation. They will feel like they have been physically kicked. In other words, you could convince an ignorant person that they were being tormented by God for being wrong. You participated in a wildcat strike at the meat plant, Mr. Johnson. The Lord will punish you. You must repent for your ways. You must never strike again. The Lord does not like you to strike. And He's going to send an angel to torment you. And then they'll turn on the microwave machine and say, "Yes, Mr. Johnson, I am an angel of the Lord. You should not have struck the plant, Mr. Johnson. We don't like that up here, and we like you, Mr. Johnson. We want you to go to heaven when you die, but you won't if you strike. So we're going to show you what is going to happen to you if you strike again." And they'll get microwaves in their head. They will be told that an angel of the Lord is going to punish them. What it will be this technology. They will feel like they're being kicked, but they won't see anybody kicking them. They'll experience auditory hallucinations. They will be made to feel pain, because you can be made to feel burning sensations and other things without actually being burned by utilizing the most sophisticated forms of mind control currently under advanced R&D and development. And poor old Mr. Johnson's not going to strike. He'll never go out on strike again because he'll be thinking he's been tormented by an angel of the Lord. And that's what Pastor Karl-Heinz Luftwaffe is going to tell him, too. I think that in addition to mind control per se, another form of technology that will be combined with this will be the use of diseases. Now, again, I'm going to gloss quickly over something that is in and of itself worthy of a lecture. And in fact, I have done a lecture in the past about AIDS called AIDS, Epidemic or Weapon of War. Genetic engineering itself offers a number of possibilities for social control. In the first place, in the application of genetic engineering to diseases, According to what I've been able to glean from the literature, AIDS is just the beginning. AIDS is to the future of biological warfare what the bow and arrow is to the atomic bomb or the ICBM. From the literature, and obviously to a certain extent one has to extrapolate and weed out information, the state of the art with regard to genetic engineering and biological warfare at this stage of the game involves some very, very sophisticated created microorganisms, either bacterium and or viruses. One of the things that is at the crest of the breaking wave of R&D into biological warfare is the creation of genetically engineered microorganisms which would be responsive to a particular environmental factor, such as a particular frequency of electromagnetic radiation. This is something which in the 80s, according to a number of sources, was under advanced research and development. This type of biological warfare would involve the vectoring of a population with a genetically engineered organism, again a bacterium and or a virus, which would remain dormant within the organism until the environment in which they both existed is subjected to a particular frequency of electromagnetic radiation, at which point the organism becomes virulently active and kills the host in a very, very short period of time. Among the possibilities foreseen as within the achievable future in the 1980s were devices which could kill a human being in a matter of seconds or minutes. I think that the use of biological warfare technologies and genetically engineered microorganisms in that particular context could be combined with fascism and religion to, again, produce a particular type of effect. Say, again, you have one of these spy priests, say Guru Bhagwan Sri Panzafir, and he's preaching to his loyal followers that if they engage in a particular practice, for example, social organizing or attempting to clean up the environment, that this is against the will of, Krishna or whoever, Ramtha or whoever, or whatever deity or supernatural entity is portrayed as the dominant power. In fact, the dominant power will be the technology of the corporate state, and it will be applied in fashion to be determined by these spy priests. Say you have a group of people who are protesting that a chemical plant is pouring toxic waste into their drinking water supply. Well, what you do is you then take that population group and you spread these microorganisms throughout the particular population group, and then the spy priest, in this case Guru Panzafir, says, oh no, now you see this group of people over here in Roseville, they were protesting against the chemical plant. Now Dow Chemical has a particular place in creation according to Krishna. So when Dow Chemical wants to put its toxic waste into the water supply, this is all part of the great plan. The people in Roseville have interfered with the will of Krishna, and they are going to be punished. Krishna does not like people to interfere with his will. Then, the poor bastards over in Roseville, who will have had these microorganisms, they will have been vectored, then they turn on the frequency that activates them, and within a matter of seconds or minutes, these people die in agony. According to one projection, people's cells could be made to explode in such a way as that the blood would issue from their eyes, ears, mouth, etc. They would die in agony in a matter of seconds or minutes. That could be a very, very useful tool for social control. If you have a group of people that are out of line in one way or another, if they're social activists or protesting against something they shouldn't be protesting against, you have whatever spy priest from whatever religion saying to the people that they want to control, this group of people has screwed up. They are going to be punished by God. Then, when they turn on whatever device it is, and these people die in agony because that frequency stimulates these microorganisms and brings them into an active and highly deadly state, well then, the group of people that have been preached to are going to be converts. They're going to say, boy, I'm not going to protest when Dow Chemical pours toxic waste into my water supply. Did you see what happened to all those poor people over in Roseville? That can be the plagues of Egypt, the plagues of the Bible. In this case, however, being created by Homo sapiens, not by any sort of supernatural or godlike creature, will be an element of social control. Two things that have been projected as devices for weapons of mass destruction in the 21st century are natural disasters, meaning storms, weather, and also seismic events such as earthquakes. The United States and the Soviet Union had a treaty on weather warfare in 1969. That's a quarter of a century ago or more at this point. What that means is that by 1969, weather warfare was either a practical reality or close enough in terms of R&D as to warrant a treaty about banning weather warfare by both sides during the Cold War. Because the goal of warfare ultimately is to occupy the enemy's territory with your own troops, usually for economic gain, nuclear weapons and also to a certain extent chemical and biological weapons are impractical in that particular regard because as destructive as they are, when they are applied in a realistic context of warfare, it makes the occupation of the territory of the enemy that has been destroyed very difficult, because in the case of nuclear weapons, you have radioactivity, which renders the environment highly toxic to one's own troops or one's own population. Same is also true with chemical and biological weapons. For that reason, military strategists have long foreseen storms and seismic events as weapons of mass destruction in the 21st century. By the same token, I think that excess populations, whether people who are simply deemed useless or people who are deemed to be downright troublesome, say a group of people that are engaged in a guerrilla warfare, say the people down in Chiapas. You want to suppress the people down in Chiapas? If they're not listening to Pastor Karl-Heinz Luftwaffe or Father whatever, then you create an earthquake, a devastating earthquake, and you tell the believers that the Lord is angry with the Zapatistas. You know, they are assured their lot may be a painful one, but it is necessary for people to suffer. Suffering is a blessing. Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and render unto God what is God's. Then you cause a hurricane to strike that region, or flooding. You have tremendous rains which cause rivers to flood, or a typhoon, or something that's going to create an earthquake, some sort of natural disaster. Then, and you say this is God's punishment on the non-believer, that's a very, very good way of either eliminating people who are in the way or convincing other people that they had better not emulate behavior which is proscribed. My own research has suggested to me that if it is not possible already to cause earthquakes, that seismic weaponry is under an advanced state of research and development. Indeed, I think there is circumstantial evidence that at least some of the top secret military missions of the space shuttle may, I'm not saying were, but may very well have been connected with either the development of or actual application of seismic warfare. There are some Swedish seismologists who have long advocated that where there is sufficient stress built up on a fault system, that the use of microwaves, again, and various forms of electromagnetic radiation, particularly microwaves, could be used to gradually release the stress on that fault system so as to prevent a catastrophic earthquake. That same principle could also be used to release the stress in such a way as to have a catastrophic earthquake. Again, with a class of spy priests, aware that the weather could be manipulated, that a hurricane or a typhoon could be created and applied to an area, assuming that one could, or by the same token that catastrophic flooding and or droughts and or earthquakes could be brought about. And these have all been projected for the 21st century, in which we're almost there, as weapons of mass destruction. And again, this is not my prediction, but rather the prediction of military strategists. I think that in the world to come, the manipulation of natural events, plagues, storms, droughts, flooding, earthquakes, these are things that could very easily be represented as the punishment of the divine against the iniquitous, and therefore the behavior that the iniquitous have demonstrated should not, under any circumstances, be repeated. Another technology that I think is very likely to be applied are so-called UFOs. There is a lecture available from Archives on Audio, also a similar lecture available from She Who Remembers. And once again, I'm glossing over a lot of very important subjects very quickly because due to the limitations of time, we haven't got the time to detail some of these things as effectively as I'd like. There are substantive indications that UFOs are real. Circular flying machines are real, but they don't come from outer space. They were developed right here on terra firma. The January 1995 issue of Popular Mechanics has a cover story saying UFOs are real and talking about secret testing of circular flying machines by our military over the decades. There were circular flying machines in the air over Europe during the closing days of World War II. any good history of the 8th Army Air Force's activities in Western Europe and Germany during the closing days of World War II will have an account of the so-called Foo Fighters, or Krautballs, glowing circular flying machines that were deployed by the Germans in the air as anti-aircraft devices during the closing months of World War II. Foo, F-O-O, was a corruption of the French word for fire, feu, F-E-U. These things at night appeared to be glowing, burning balls, and they were used for neutralizing the electronics of Allied warplanes during the closing months of the war. In fact, SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters Allied European Front, I think, anyway, Forces, that's what the F stands for, and SHAPE actually issued a statement in December of 1944 that these devices, these circular glowing things, were new anti-aircraft weapons being deployed by the Third Reich. There, in 1955, Secretary of the Air Force Donald Quarles issued a statement saying that in combination with Canada, the U.S. Air Force was developing a new tactical warplane which would look like the popular conception of UFOs. He was talking about the Avro car. The okey-doke, by the way, the okey-doke with regard to the UFO question is the ET myth. There is absolutely no indication whatsoever that we have ever been visited by anybody from another planet. If there's life on other planets, intelligent life on other planets, there is no indication that it has ever visited the Earth. Now, I dealt with this in a previous lecture. The origins of the ET myth, if you find the first ET contacts, they actually precede the first UFO sightings in the post-World War II period. It's very interesting that a lot of the people who were the first contactees either had connections with national security institutions like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, and or fascist organizations and mystical organizations like William Dudley Pelley's Soulcraft, a mystical organization formed by William Dudley Pelley, who previously was head of the Silver Shirts, an American Nazi organization during the 30s and 40s that actually worked with Third Reich intelligence to try and overthrow the American government. The Silver Shirts overlapped heavily with a mystical fascist movement called the I Am movement, headed up by Guy and Edna Ballard, which, by the way, looked to Mount Shasta as a sacred place where they would go for their meetings. Elements of the I Am movement eventually evolved into the Church Universal and Triumphant of Elizabeth Clare Prophet, currently holding forth near Yellowstone National Park, excuse me. The use of so-called UFOs, I think, as devices of social control, representing them either as our brothers from space, superior beings in possession of technology far beyond anything ever seen on Earth, much wiser and much more powerful than we are. Therefore, we should turn control of our lives over to our brothers from space, might be one of the scenarios in which so-called UFOs could be utilized to get people to submit to a totalitarian political system in the belief that this system was actually a benevolent system. One of the first things that interested me in the whole question of UFOs was when Billy Graham in 1984, I saw a statement in 1984 about Billy Graham where he said, UFOs are real and they're angels sent by Jesus. Now, Billy Graham is a political animal. He is nothing if not political. And when he started saying UFOs are real and they're angels that come from Jesus, I started saying, I wonder. I think that one of the possibilities in the future is that Christian redemptionist theology, the notion of the rapture and tribulation, may very well combine with elements of New Age religion. In fact, in some of the ramblings of Shirley MacLaine, we're seeing the same thing. So that we could have a UFO-born version of the rapture and tribulation where the believers will all be taken up to some point in space, either maybe the moon or space stations or someplace where they might not particularly like what they find, but in the belief that the UFOs are in fact being sent by Jesus to rescue all the believers from Earth before the tribulation, when fires and floods and plagues and all this kind of stuff would ravage the non-believers. That's what the tribulation is in Christian redemptionist theology. I could see a version of technologically based bogus Christian redemptionism in which UFOs would be seen as messengers from Jesus, angels, what have you, to take all of the good believing Christians or all of the deserving people up into space, up to the kingdom of God, while all the non-believers get ravaged by the tribulation. There is a very strong tradition in human society to believe in salvation from above. Most of the divine monarchs who rule, not only in European culture but elsewhere, have portrayed themselves as direct descendants of a deity. The Japanese and Mayan kings, for example, like the kings of Egypt and the queens of Egypt, just like the kings and queens of Europe portrayed themselves as descendants of divinity, usually the sun. Usually these jerks think they've evolved from the sun. I mean, that's the most, you see the sun in the sky and say, oh yes, I'm evolved from the sun, who was my father, this, that, and the other thing. In a time of terrible trial, with the ozone layer gone, the rainforest disappearing, global warming, flooding the low-lying coastal areas, and people being ravaged by plagues, ravaged by poverty, and bear in mind, propagandized and very poorly educated, I think it would be relatively easy to get them to believe in salvation from above. Then you bring down the UFOs, and by this time, people are going to be so beset, it won't matter what comes out of the UFO. It won't matter whether it's Jesus or a hologram or just some guy wearing a suit to make him look like a little green man from space or from Mars, or whether it's Richard Simmons wearing pantyhose and a Donald Duck mask. People are going to believe in what comes out of that UFO because they are going to be hell-bent for leather to believe in something. They want to bow down to something, and they will believe in whatever comes out of that UFO. I think that is a very, very real possibility. Again, I haven't got the time to go into the whole ET question, but an awful lot of the early ET contacts, for example, there was a contact by a fellow named Adamski in 1952 who met a Venusian in the desert. Now, the Venusian was tall with long blonde hair and fair skin and blue eyes. Now we know that if there's any kind of life on Venus, it's nothing like anything we know because the conditions there are not hospitable to Venus, to life forms, particularly not life forms which just happen to look like the Aryan stereotype, tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned sons of bitches. There's an old joke that used to go around in resistance circles in Nazi Germany, that the ideal German is blonde like Hitler, tall like Goebbels, and slim like Goering. And that's, I think, very similar to what will be held up as the ideal. There's another very worthwhile thing to take note of in the ET mythology, and that is the notion that ETs have been visiting us for a long time, and that perhaps some of them have known the daughters of man and found them fair. Many of the ET cults, and there are a lot of ET cults around which propose that basically the ET usually involve the creation of a worldwide totalitarian system in which human beings are not wise enough to administer their own affairs. Instead, it's going to be administered by our brothers from space, who are not only wiser than we are, but also, not incidentally, much more powerful than we are. There's no indication, again, that we've ever been visited by people from outer space. I think many of the contacts have either been accomplished through deliberate propaganda, just flat-out lies. Also mind control. An awful lot of the people who've supposedly been abducted by aliens, it turns out after they've been hypnotically regressed, the flying saucer turns out to have been a helicopter or a black van or something altogether terrestrial. Also the notion that a higher civilization would travel light years through space in order to play tag with a couple of rednecks in Pascagoula, Mississippi, I think strains credibility under the circumstances. Rather, it's much more likely that someone wants us to believe that we're being visited by somebody from outer space. So I think UFOs themselves could be very, very powerful devices for social control. I think eventually human civilization will, or what's left of it, will move out into space as the Earth becomes inhospitable. I think that space development, space exploration, and industrial development have some very positive possibilities. Certainly, if we could mine and obtain our natural resources in space, it would eliminate a lot of the resultant pollution here on Earth. I think eventually, as we foul our nest, we will move out into space, and I foresee an eventual transplanting of the human race into outer space, assuming that our technology permits us to survive out there as we poison the Earth. I also think that the dictates of the corporate state may very well result in the replacement of workers with other things to perform tasks specifically. Now, this is something that has actually been discussed, and in fact there was a lot of debate in the mid-1980s, and that is using genetic engineering to create new species. In fact, in 1985 there was a hot exchange between a number of scientists and the Vatican. There were proposals being floated to take some human genes
and to splice them into primates so that you would create a new species, not as intelligent as human beings, perhaps, but far more intelligent than orangutans, chimpanzees, what have you, in order to perform tasks of menial labor. Now, these creatures would not have human rights because they would not, in fact, be human. So if you have a problem where you have to get a bunch of people to schlep a bunch of minerals up out of a mountainside, and it's very costly to provide for the safety of the workers, get a bunch of genetically engineered creatures who could schlep the minerals out of the mountainside, and you wouldn't have to worry about them getting sick and dying because they wouldn't be human. Also, the development of robotics, I think, at some point in the future will be used to gradually replace the worker. I think that we may ultimately, and this might be millennia in the future, assuming we survive, I think that the imperfections of human beings, and human beings are highly imperfect, may ultimately lead to the creation of artificial intelligences. It would not surprise me if we survive long enough that at some point in the future we might create an artificial intelligence, a machine which would actually represent something of a life form, in that it would be self-conscious and intelligent enough to regard itself as separate from its actual creators. It would not surprise me if these machines eventually decided to turn on their creators. Now, we're talking about something that might take place thousands of years in the future, and decide that basically the machines should supplant people altogether because people are sloppy. You know, they have cells, they get sick, they have emotions, they have feelings, and however much we try to get them to sit on the tack, it just doesn't work. However, a machine can sit on the tack because it doesn't have any feelings. You just don't put any circuitry in that part of its construction. It would not surprise me if we eventually, at some point in the future, built machines which replaced us quite consciously, saying that people are stupid. You know, they're stupid, they're weak, they have emotions, they are inefficient, and they are not really in keeping with the dictates of the corporate state. If we created a machine at some point in the future, maybe 10,000 years or 20,000 years from now, would simply put us out of existence because we are not efficient. This obviously is rumination. I can't say that would happen, but I would not dismiss that possibility. The long and the short of it is that ultimately I think we are going to find ourselves, I think we're already in that position, but if we are going to survive as a species, if civilization is going to endure, we're going to have to ask a whole lot more questions about the world we're living in than most of us are asking right now. I think people may have seen the movie The Wizard of Oz, and there's that scene where they go to see the wizard, and they're seeing a very impressive pyrotechnical display with all of the flashing lightning and the booming sound effects. And then Toto the dog pulls apart the curtain, and we see there's just a little nerd over there throwing a bunch of switches. And the wizard says, "Pay no attention to that man behind the curtain." Well, what I'm saying to you tonight is pay a great deal of attention to the man behind the curtain, because I suspect that those problems are going to be caused by the man behind the curtain throwing switches, and that it really will not be Krishna working for Guru Bhagwan Sri Panzafure, or Jesus working to Pasha Karl-Heinz Luftwaffe, or any other form of okey-doke. And I'm not saying religion per se is an okey-doke, but I think that it is already being used by certain cynical and powerful forces as an okey-doke, and I think that technology and religion will be combined in the world to come to create a totalitarian state to get people to accept the unacceptable. So the message this evening is, like that little frog that's getting swallowed by the bird, grab the throat of your oppressor and of your would-be devourer. Don't let him swallow you, and above all else, pay a great deal of attention to that man behind the curtain. Thanks so much.